Hello and welcome to Conversations with Ex-Catholics. I am Kevin Non-Tradicaf, and I am very excited, though I don't think excited is the right word, for today's episode. Today I am joined by Megan. Megan, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I think that the conversation that we're going to have today is an important one to have because, from what I understand, you grew up in the SSPV. Um, tell me about that.
Yes, I did. From birth until about 10 years ago, I was in the SSPV. My grandparents were kind of instrumental in it being a group. You know, we're talking time, talent, treasure going into that. And I never knew anything different. Until I was in my mid 20s and started working at a Catholic school and, kind of convinced myself that I was going to go to hell for going to the Novus Ordo Mass that happened once a month there.
Hmm.
And, that sort of led to a period of deconstruction. But yeah, about 30 years in the SSPV for me. Six
Jeez.
of those I went to the school.
Wow. So you were in it for
I was in
sure.
it.
Um. So in terms of where we want to start with everything, I don't know if you had a specific plan in mind, but I already see a comment actually just looking for the difference between the SSPX and the SSPV. I know we were going to get there. Did you maybe
Yes,
want to start with kind of like a higher
sure.
level view?
So I'm actually gonna start just a little before that. I
Okay.
kind of have a little bit of a not a disclaimer, but I sort of wanted to say in coming on here today, my goal isn't to bash the SSPV and certainly not anyone in it. The people in the pews are not the problem. The people in the pews are people who are generally super well meaning, looking for truth, trying to do the right thing. They're on a journey just like the rest of us. And my goal is to sort of bring things to light that the group is not super forthcoming about. That might really be helpful for people who are thinking about leaving or who are um, trying to figure out what's really going on with this group. That's my hope in is that I can explain a little bit of the background, which took me a long time to figure out, and maybe people can make informed decisions about that from there. Um,
I love that. I think it's always good to start on a note of, hey, look, we may say some things today about the SSPV, but it's important. And when I talk about the FSSP all the time, it's always important to separate individuals, right, from a group. And it's possible that it's possible to critique a group without critiquing any individual too, you know? And I think that's important to say. So I'm really glad that you started on that note.
Yeah. As far as what the difference between the SSPX and the SSPV are, the SSPX was sort of the first priestly fraternity to come out of the Vatican II, the changes in the Mass, and everything that went along with that. And they were originally completely condoned by Rome. Like they had full, you know, they were fully in communion with Rome as far as any of that went. They had a papal mission statement and all of that when they first started, and that of course was Archbishop Lefebvre or Lefebvre, depending on how you're going to pronounce it,
That's right.
who who created that group and was the head of that group. And it was a really loose organization of priests, right? They weren't taking vows like Jesuits do or Franciscans. They weren't wearing a different attire or anything like that. It was essentially just they wanted to maintain the Latin Mass, and they would say pre-Vatican II morality. That would be something that they would say, and that kind of went on from right at the end of Vatican II. So we're talking like I think the seminary, the SSPX seminary in Switzerland was established in 1968, I want to say, and immediately young men from other seminaries who weren't happy with the changes, wanted to continue saying the Latin Mass and all of that, went to Switzerland to be part of that seminary. And then from there, Archbishop Lefebvre started consecrating priests who came out of that seminary. So the first group of priests, Clarence Kelly, Bishop Clarence Kelly, who has actually, I should mention, has just passed away about a little over a week ago. So, I remember I had said to you, do you want to postpone this interview in light of recent events? He's the leader of the SSPV, and he was in that first class of seminarians who went in there. So the SSPV later on broke off from the SSPX. So all the people that we're going to talk about, that first wave, so to speak, of SSPV priests are all they were originally SSPX priests, and I believe they were all ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre in Switzerland.
And these were the illegal canonizations, right?
So no, actually,
Oh,
these were all legal.
okay.
Archbishop Lefebvre didn't run into problems. He was asked not to create any bishops.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah, so he was asked not to create any bishops, and at some point went ahead and did that anyway, because when you look at the documentation, Archbishop Lefebvre kind of always had a foot in each camp, right? He always was like, we're going to get back together with the, kind of like a spurned like boyfriend or something. We're going to get back together. No, we're not going to get back together. Kind of a foot in each camp. But he was definitely not, a set of vacantists. He believed the Pope was the Pope. The SSPX, up until a certain point, always believed that the Pope was the Pope. And his excommunication came because he consecrated bishops at some point, but I believe that was lifted before his death. I might be wrong on that. I'm not sure.
Okay. So far we've gotten to the
Right.
SSPV. Yeah.
Right. So Clarence Kelly, you can't talk about the SSPV without it kind of being his, life story in a nutshell. So he joins the seminary, he's ordained, and almost immediately after his ordination, is sent to the United States and made the superior general of the Northeast United States. So we're talking about like a really young priest. He had been in the Air Force before the seminary. And interestingly, I was listening to like this interview with, I think, Father Cicada, who's another SSPX, then SSPV priest, who made like this off the cuff mention that Clarence Kelly was in like a mind control like type unit where he studied brainwashing in the Air Force, and that was like a part of his charisma was that he knew how to do that, which I thought was kind of a weird comment.
Yeah, it's a little weird.
I'm like, he definitely is charismatic. He definitely could get people to do things, but I'm not sure that I would go that far. Although Father Shikata would probably know better than I would,
Fair
since
enough.
he worked and lived with them for a long time. Yeah. So, and there, a few other priests who become kind of a big part of the SSPV start being ordained. Father Jenkins, who's the only priest that's still in the SSPV, Father Cicada, who I mentioned, now Bishop Dolan, Sanborn, a few others. And they're kind of all doing their own thing at this point. Like I said, the SSPX is a super loose organization. It's more like a fraternal organization than anything else. Like, think more Knights of Columbus and less Jesuits, and it's basically about the formation of priests in the traditional mass than anything else. At that point, I think they had established another seminary in Michigan. They established another seminary in Connecticut, and they're kind of popping mass centers around all over the place. The first one, interestingly enough, was in then Father Kelly's brother's garage in Wantagh, New York, on Long Island, where I never personally went, but my uncle served mass there when he was a little kid. My grandparents used to go there
Wow.
to the garage mass. Yeah.
So that means that your family has kind of been there
Yes.
since the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah. My mom was like, I don't remember going to the garage mass, but I have pictures of my uncle serving the garage mass.
Wow.
Sure. And then pretty quickly they outgrew that because, I really have a lot of like really love and compassion in my heart for these people because especially in Long Island, Diocese of Rockville Center, I mean, you had people who had been just going to the mass, just kind of faithful Catholics their whole life. And then, literally, one weekend at the end of 1964, everything changes. And you really had priests that went nuts with with the changes in a way that probably Rome wouldn't have approved of at that time. And you have these people that are like, what is happening? um it's not crazy to think that they would have sought out something different, even if it was in a garage. I feel for them. I know my grandparents used to talk a lot about that time and how confusing and chaotic it was. So, it's tough.
It's not hard to sympathize with like the early trads in the sense that
No.
it 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 was scary, and I bet you that in a lot of respects it was actually um in some respects I bet you that the garage masses were actually more familiar than the mass at the local church, you know?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember my grandmother telling me that, they went to church one day and the whole place was a construction zone because they pulled out the old altar and they were like putting it in the middle of the church. So everything was around it. And she was like, what is this? What is happening? So, that's pretty scary, in a lot of ways, I think. Um, but at that point, at a certain point, they had switched to doing mass at a VFW hall because they outgrew the garage. And then eventually they bought the property in Oyster Bay, where they still are today, although they have other properties on Long Island now too. And the funny thing about that property in Oyster Bay is they got it for an absolute song. I mean, it's gold. It's the Gold Coast. It should be very expensive. It's on several acres of property. Beautiful old building, tennis court. The church is what used to be the ballroom. Um, but there was a murder there. So no one wanted the property.
Ay.
Um,
That's
there
why
had
it
been
was
a
cheap.
murder. It was very cheap. So the way they went about it, now this is still the SSPX, you have to remember, and they didn't have a lot of guidance from the organization as a whole as to how to buy property when it was available. So what they would do is they would set up these little shell LLCs and they would call them like American Friends of the Society of St. Pius X Northeast, American Society of the Society of, American Friends of the Society of St. Pius X California, whatever. And then they would buy property through them. Eventually, when there's problems, this becomes a big issue, because there's all these properties and now it's like, well, who owns them? Because the American Friends it's a shell corporation, a shell LLC set up, essentially by whoever was a lawyer who went to the mass. So that becomes a problem later down the line.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like I think about how my little FSSP chapel was formed, and it was more or less just a couple families who were all interested in having a traditionalist mass, kind of emptied their bank accounts and purchased an old abandoned church,
Yeah.
and they just like asked the FSSP to move in, and they did. And
Yeah.
so, um, I bet you that my church has its fair share of issues, even litigation and stuff like that. I mostly don't know about that stuff. But it's easy to see. Like I can easily imagine where something like that goes wrong because, like you said, the lawyer who just the one guy who happened to attend that mass who was a lawyer
Right.
was the guy
Right.
who opened up the shell corporation. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I can
Essentially.
I can see that being a problem in the future.
And especially when you're talking about properties that could potentially be worth a lot of money. I mean, right now the property in Oyster Bay is valued over $5 million.
Whoa,
Like if
really?
you sold it today, yeah, yeah, it's like J Lo has an estate down the street from it. Like,
Really?
yeah,
Whoa, I did not know that.
yeah, it's in a super super wealthy area.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like the one of the wealthiest areas probably in the world. Like when you think of like the Gold Coast, the Vanderbilts, all of that, this is where these people lived.
Oh, wow. How many, like, is it an acre? Like how much land are we talking about? Is the SSPV on?
It's on 2 acres, and then I think
All
where the
right.
school is on more. I want to say they might have 5 acres over where the school is, but that's in a different town. So,
Oh,
and then
interesting.
yeah, and then the upstate. I mean, that's upwards of 125 acres, possibly more
Okay, but it's
in the Catskills.
the 125 acres in the Catskills is probably worth less than the 2 acres on
Oh,
Long
a
Island,
hundred
right?
percent. Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Yep. My family used to go on vacation up to the Catskills. So,
yeah.
if the audience doesn't know, I grew up in northern Jersey. So I like the
Okay.
the Northeast region is kind of like the mecca of traditional. Well, that's not entirely true because of Cincinnati. But if
I
you
was gonna say you forgot
yeah,
Cincinnati.
that's right. So if you kind of go like from Cincinnati to Boston or whatever, that's probably where traditionalism is focused. Obviously, SSPX, FSSP has stuff out in California, in Oregon, in Washington, all that stuff. But I feel like it's concentrated in the Northeast.
Yeah,
And so my family went on vacation to the Catskills every summer. And
yeah,
like it wasn't a glamorous vacation, it's the Catskills. Like,
yeah.
um
And even though like no one ever told me this, so my grandparents had a house upstate New York, not far from where Round Top is, for like many years, and so did some of their friends who ended up being part of the SSPV. And I have to wonder, like, if anyone was like, "Hey, Father Kelly, this is like a good spot to," you know. I don't know that
could
though.
be.
That's just me. That's just me guessing. So the SSPX kind of rolls along, but there's internal divisions because, now Archbishop Lefebvre is over in Switzerland. These priests are in the United States and they're pretty much have carte blanche to do whatever they want. They have 2 seminaries at some point, one in Michigan, one in Connecticut. They're setting up mission chapels all over the place. I mean, they're doing mass in hotel rooms and people's houses and traveling all over the place. They have they have a mass center in Cincinnati. They have mass center in on Long Island. So there's places that are bigger, but they're going everywhere and doing this. And at that point, they were saying mass from the earlier missal. So this would be like the 1950 rubric of the mass. Whereas in Switzerland, they were teaching the priests the 1962, they would call it the conciliar missal. So the changes are so negligible as to be not even anything you would notice. Like we were talking about before the stream started, FSSP uses the 1962, SSPX still uses the 1962, SSPV uses the 1950. So with the exception of they did some stuff to like Holy Week that they didn't go along with or whatever. But so that essentially causes the big problem because they're not really doing what Archbishop Lefebvre wants. And at some point he says it's a problem of American obstinacy or something. He calls it opinionism and a couple of other things, like basically saying like these people don't like to take guidance. But it is a loose organization. It's like the Knight of Columbus with the sword telling all the other Knights of Columbus what to do. They're like, hey, we're just Knights of Columbus. Like, you can't really tell us what to do. So after some back and forth, and they get sort of kicked out and then let back in, Archbishop Lefebvre comes personally to the United States in, hold on, 1983. So this is 1983 now, and kicks the 9 priests who are sort of the troublemakers out. And, I think it's funny because you read about this stuff and they call them the Nine in all caps. It's sort of funny, like they're, I don't know, a superhero gang or something like that.
Yeah, or from like a fan, like it almost reminds me like the Nine Ringwraiths from Lord of the Rings.
That's
You know what I
exactly
mean?
what my husband said.
I like your husband. That's really funny.
So he kicks them out, and this starts basically a land grab where, you know, technically, even though it's the American Friends on most of the property, they are, you know, the American Friends of the SSPX. They're kind of going through and they're like, well, whatever building we can sort of occupy, ownership is 9/10 of the law here. So, Oyster Bay, the priests are living there at the time, so they're not leaving. They end up they end up going into litigation for a lot of these. I mean, years upon years of suing back and forth, writing letters back and forth. At this point, Archbishop Lefebvre is in really poor health. He's having to come back and forth from Switzerland to New York to do depositions and things about who owns these properties. And at the end of the day, again, after years of this, they SSPV, because they rename themselves, right? They have to call themselves something. So now they're the those 9 priests start the SSPV, Society of St. Pius V, and they are, they get, I think it's 4 properties. I know 2 of them are Oyster Bay and the Cincinnati, what was St. Gertrude the Great in Cincinnati. And they get these 4 properties for just under $200,000. That's what they have to pay. So when you consider what the properties are worth, I mean, even the one in Cincinnati it's in the city, but it's like it's in the city. It's people want to be there. So they probably got a few $1,000,000 worth of property for around $200,000, which is not a bad deal when you consider it. And
No.
when you have lawyers from your parish probably donating their time
Yeah.
to it.
I can speak to at least the FSSP. There was a wealth in like volunteer hours
Yeah.
from people in the community. Like there was like a guy who was like an accountant by day, and he did like all of the accounting for the church, right? And he never charged.
Right.
And we had lawyers too who would do, I don't know exactly what they did, but they did lawyer stuff. So I have to imagine that the SSPV, it's pretty similar, right?
Yeah. And when the nuns started putting music out and things later, there was someone who like had an in with a recording studio, and there was someone who was a musician, and so a lot of that kind of thing, which I mean, that's what you do for organizations that you're you're into and you want to help grow,
Right.
that's, I don't see an inherent problem with when you combine it with a lot of other things. That's sort of where you run into issues, I think. um, so so again, just huge litigation, a lot of stuff going on. What I'm going to talk about now is from a lot of interviews that 3 of the priests who ended up leaving the SSPV have spoken very publicly about and written very publicly about. So none of this is like my own opinion about it or anything. This is stuff that is out, very out there, if you are someone who can, cares to look for it.
And maybe I can just interrupt here too to say,
Sure.
when you say that it's out there, I believe you that it is out there, but it's hard to find some of this
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why I think that this interview is important is because we are bringing to light stuff that is hard to
Yeah, I
find.
mean,
It's
this is
public,
all
but it's
stuff
hard to
that's
find.
taken like 8 years to put together.
Yeah.
It's out there. You have to know what rabbit holes to look down. I will say in the past 3 years, there's a group that I don't recommend. It's called, I think it's like True Restoration or something. I think they're an SSPX group, or maybe they're affiliated with Bishop Sanborn's group down in Florida. I'm not 100% sure. A lot of their recordings are not anything that I would recommend listening to if you care for your mental health. But there's a lot of interviews that those priests have done about what happened during this time frame, and those have just been put on online in the past maybe 2 years, somewhere like that. So when I discovered those, I was like, oh, okay, this makes a lot more sense about things. And then, I filed a lot of FOIA requests. I looked at a lot of, case law backlog on years that I knew that there should be court decisions and stuff out there. Yeah, it was a lot of research. I did it so you all don't have to.
Well, I know that I appreciate that. I think my whole audience does too. So,
So again, what I'm about to say, like, it's not my own opinion or anything like that. It's just what these priests have said about what happened. So essentially, again, the split comes in 1983. The SSPV is now 9 priests, and pretty quickly there seems to be Father Kelly really becoming the leader, even though there isn't supposed to be a leader. It's supposed to be sort of more or less democratic, where if big expenditures are happening, they kind of all agree on it. If big decisions are made, they should all agree on it. And what Father Shikata says later on in interviews is that all of a sudden in 1984, there's $100,000 gone from what's supposed to be the Oyster Bay Building Fund. And when Father
ooh,
Kelly is questioned about this, he said, yes, I used it to buy a property in Round Top. We're building. Like, it's the building fund and we're building. And essentially, the idea behind that was it was going to be an order of nuns that he wanted to start. The other priests are like super opposed to this. They were like, we don't want this. We're brand new. Like, let's get our legs under us. And Father Kelly was absolutely saying that he was starting this order of nuns, which becomes the Daughters of Mary. So they it's the property upstate started out as a like a I guess like a resort, like a mountain resort type of thing, but I think it was in pretty rundown shape when they got their hands on it. So, the first groups of nuns are kind of living in these cabins and whatnot. It's not great conditions from what I understand. And that's sort of used among the parishioners to be like, hey, we need more money. The poor nuns, look how they're living. It's such a bad situation. But right away, the other priests have negative things to say about it. And like I said, Father Shikata and Father Dolan have been really outspoken as far as that goes, in terms of now, well, Father Dolan's passed away, but saying, we didn't want this. This was the problems we saw with the nuns. They were really concerned that the nuns didn't have their own internal government. Orders of nuns are supposed to kind of run themselves and have like a spiritual director and a priest, and these ones didn't. Father Kelly was the be all end all of them.
and were these nuns, and you'll have to, forgive if, this
No,
is a
no.
stupid question. Were these nuns mostly like, were they just SSPV parishioners who decided that they wanted to become nuns, but they didn't want to enter into any old convent? They wanted to do,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So you won't, even now, I mean, you won't find a girl from like the FSSP like wants to be a nun and drives up to Round Top. They'd be like, no,
Okay. Okay.
you can't come in.
Okay. I figured. I was just, I wanted to double check.
But at this point, you have to remember it is kind of mixed. Like, these people were just SSPX like a second ago, you know.
Yeah.
So there is kind of a mix of tradies, I guess, as opposed to now the party lines have sort of been drawn. I think they were a little bit more wishy-washy. And the first Mother Superior of the order, Sister Mary Cabrini, she who's not the same Sister Mary Cabrini who's still in the order. I want to clarify that there's another Sister Mary Cabrini. She's lovely. But the original one, she was from an SSPX convent
Okay.
and left there to help Father Kelly start that group. And what the other priests have said over the years is that, she had a strong will. Like, she was a Mother Superior, and this is how she was going to run her order. And that kind of caused clashing, more or less right away between the two of them. And, in open letters, notarized letters, some of the priests had written, like, those are public, and said to Father Kelly, we really have concerns. Like, these nuns are not being properly formed. We feel as though the personality is being kind of crushed out of them. We're not fans. And they put that in writing several times to him. And then we're basically told, it, too
Tough.
bad.
Yeah.
The school was formed on Long Island in, I think, 1986, and the first nuns were sent down to run it. Again, these nuns, they take private orders. So it's not like, it's not like, I hesitate to say real order of nuns. I don't want to use that language, but, like, for example, a friend of mine, her daughter joined the Dominicans of Saint Cecilia or something like that. I mean, they took public orders. It's really holy orders. Like, it's a real vow, and they don't. It's kind of like, I think it was one of the priests whose interview I was listening to is like, it's basically like making a promise to yourself not to eat chocolate for the rest of your life. Spiritually, that's kind of the connotation that that happens there. And that's sort of sad, and I wonder if these ladies know that. Not that they'll ever see this interview, but
Right. Um, Now, I have to imagine that these ladies don't see it that way, probably, right? Like, they might view their order as being just as legitimate as any other order, but
100%.
it's just that there's no structure to their order, kind of, right? Like, it's...
Yeah, so from what I understand about how it's, again, this is all just speculation, because everything about the group is very secretive. If you're not in and you don't know what questions to ask, and even if you did, they probably wouldn't answer them straight. You'd never know. So, does the order now have a board of directors? I was reading, one of the nuns passed away maybe a few years ago, and I was reading her obituary, and it said she, served in the governance of the community, and I was like, well, what does that mean?
What does that mean? It's a good question.
If I went online and looked up, a particular order of nuns, I could easily see not only who the Mother Superior is, but I could see, who's in charge of the novitiate, who's in charge of, different aspects, because that's all right out there. In the same way that if I was looking up any order of priests, I could see, what their constitutions are. I was listening to the funeral sermon for Bishop Kelly, and they, one of the other bishops who gave the sermon was talking a lot about how Bishop Kelly wrote their constitutions. What constitutions? They're not public. How do you know what they are? Like, it's not available. Like, I guess if I drove to Round Top and, like, knocked on the door and asked to see their constitutions, they might let me.
Not after this
Maybe
interview.
not.
Yeah.
So, it's the secrecy of the group, I think, is what has really been wild to me after leaving. When I was in and when I was really in, I would be like, well, we don't want everyone knowing what we're doing. Like, but as I left and saw how, like, regular Catholic churches operated, I'll never forget the first time I just saw in the bulletin, like, at my normal regular Catholic parish, I opened it up, and there's, like, this insert, two or three page insert of, like, what their finances were that year, like what the priest got paid, and, like, what repairs cost, and, like, what their cars cost. Like, I was like, do churches do this? Like, I was shocked. I'd never seen that. Like, no one knew where the money went.
So the FSSP, at least I'll speak to my chapel. We didn't quite we weren't quite as open as like whatever Novus Ordo parish that was.
Right.
And I do know that some people did grumble about certain why are they eating sushi for dinner and stuff like that. I will say that I don't believe that any priests were ever acting badly with money that I knew of. Like, I didn't know any priests who drove BMWs. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um, but I know that happens in communities that have no oversight.
Yeah. And as far as cars go, that's actually funny. My grandmother passed away last year, and when we went up to New York for the funeral, I, a bunch of priests from the SSPV came. And now, way back when I was going there, I mean, the nuns drove the same broken down van for like forever. They drove it until it just wouldn't drive anymore. And the priests maybe had like an old Honda Civic or something like that. We're not talking nice cars by any stretch of the imagination, especially considering how much they traveled. But the priest pulled up and they were in like a newer, like I want to say Tahoe or something like that. And
Mm.
my sister and I looked at each other like, oh, they've come up in the world
They're
a
doing
bit.
well for themselves.
And again, that's not saying that they're mishandling any money at this point or anything like that, but I just thought it was a funny juxtaposition. Like we were so used to this. I mean, the nuns drove this blue van and they would all get out of it. They probably fit like 20 nuns in this
Like a
van.
clown car.
No joke. It was
Yeah.
like, now my kids would call them homeschooler vans.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
But they drove this van, and I mean, it was like a death trap. It was a little scary. um you were worried about the nuns driving on the highway and like they were going to crash and there's just going to be
Nuns
nuns
everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah, that's terrible. It's like funny, but it's terrible.
It's funny. I mean, I remember definitely joking about it with them. Like that van was a joke, and then they got some minivans at some point, but we're not talking fantastic vehicles. So at some point, I guess that's changed, and they have nicer cars now, and good for them. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
So just to get back, so the nuns cause like a big issue with these priests. They are not on board with this group being started at all, and eventually, Fathers Dolan and Chicada, and I think two other priests leave, and they leave kind of publicly over the whole situation with the nuns. They're just really not happy about how that's being run, and they leave. This doesn't really cause anything but a ripple in New York, but in Cincinnati, it causes a big problem because they had a written agreement with Father Kelly and Father Jenkins saying, we won't start a rival mass center. Like, you can have Cincinnati, right? Like, that's yours. And, they have this legal agreement. And like a month later, they start a rival mass center in Cincinnati, which is why Cincinnati then becomes sort of a hub of of tradiness at this point, and still is to this day. And of course, Kelly and Jenkins sort of get around that by saying, well, we didn't start it in Cincinnati. We started in Norwood, which is like this little town within a town type of thing, and, whatever. But at that same time, over all of this, Sister Mary Cabrini has had it with Bishop Kelly and leaves very publicly. Is like, I'm done with this. And this is right after all the kidnapped nun stuff that I'm sure you might know about.
Wait, I don't know if I do know about kidnapped nuns. Wait.
Oh, I'll get back to the kidnapped nuns.
Okay.
So in July 1988, there's this young nun. She's 22, and her parents become convinced that she is being completely brainwashed by the SSPV. Okay, like they are just really upset. They keep trying to get her to come home. Her letters keep being returned. They're convinced that she is being essentially held against her will. So they drive from, since the people are from the Cincinnati area, they drive from Ohio to Round Top, New York, and the mom goes in a rental car and pulls up to where they're taking a walk and says, oh, I have pictures of so-and-so's wedding to show you. You want to see them? And the girl gets in the car to look at the pictures, and mom takes off, puts gets on a plane with her, and takes her back to Ohio.
Wow.
At which point, when she gets back to Ohio, Sister Mary Cabrini, then the Mother Superior, is waiting for them at their gate in the airport and is like, you can't leave, get back on the plane. And the girl does. Again, girl, she's 22, she's a legal adult, but this is happening. So a couple months or a month or two later, the whole family then goes up, including the two brothers who are firemen and are like kind of jacked. They wait until the nuns are like walking down the road and forcibly put her in a car and take her away, but they don't put her on a plane this time. They bring her to a cabin that they had rented for this purpose, where they had found a therapist to come in who is experienced in brainwashing to sort of deprogram her. At which
Whoa.
point she decides, yeah, I'm not going back there. So Father, and the reason why we all know all of this is because uh, they called the police. Obviously, the convent calls the police, like this woman has been abducted in broad daylight. Uh, the FBI gets involved, the state troopers get involved, everybody gets involved, and turns out, she doesn't want to go back. It's her family, whatever. But this hits the newspapers because could you imagine being a reporter and hearing this come over on the wires of like, hey, this nun has been kidnapped?
Yeah, what the heck?
So the New York Times picks it up, and then there's a bunch of articles in the New York Times about it. And Father Kelly ends up going on the Phil Donahue show. Do you remember the Phil Donahue show?
No, that might be a little before my time,
Oh,
but
it's basically like, I don't know. It's somewhere between Oprah and Maury.
okay, okay.
But that kind of show, if you remember back, like Ricky Lake and all of that. And he goes on the show to kind of defend himself. And of course, they bring the family out and like, what do you have to say to each other and all of this. Unfortunately, the footage no longer exists. And I am so sad that it doesn't. But it's referenced all over the place in these articles that they went on this show. So a lot of publicity happens because of this. And then, just a few months later, Sister Mary Cabrini kind of has a very public split with Father Kelly over this and leaves. Because Father Shikata and Father Dolan kind of accept her at the Mass Center, because can you imagine, you're a nun in one order, then you're the Mother Superior in the other order, and then you get kicked out. Like, where do you go? You don't have
Es-
anything.
Especially when it's in like something in the SSPV where it's like the SSPV isn't connected to non SSPV Catholics in the same way that like somebody who gets kicked out of the Jesuits can still be part of the like Catholicism, right? Still part of the Catholic
Right.
Church. That's not really the case with like
No,
these like super trad organizations.
no, not at all. So she goes to Cincinnati. They kind of get her a place to live. Father Kelly goes a little bonkers that they're like allowing this disobedient nun to be there. But, Sister Mary Cabrini really has an axe to grind to hear these priests on the interviews telling it. And, she was like writing up her list of grievances and like handing them out to people as they were leaving the mass, the chapel in Cincinnati, and being like, these are problems, like this needs to be addressed. And sort of no one listens to her, and eventually she goes off, and supposedly she is still living as a nun in the Cincinnati area. I don't know, like she's not part of an order. I think she's just personally living out her vows or whatnot.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's 1989, and then 1990 is when Bishop Mendes kind of gets involved. And Bishop Mendes is definitely a Novus Ordo bishop. He's someone who um, has some sort of nostalgic feeling, I would say, towards the Latin Mass. And there's been a lot written about Bishop Mendes. I'm not here to badmouth Bishop Mendes. Um, from the SSPV point of view, he's a traditionalist who firmly believed in the Latin Mass and was very against Vatican II. The other side of the coin is that he was a confused old man who was taken away from it, taken advantage of. I think the truth is probably, as all these things are, somewhere in the middle, but he agrees to do some priestly ordinations in 1990 in secret for the SSPV, and he ordains Father Paul Baumberger, who's still there, and Father Joseph Greenwell, who's also still there. It's kind of funny. I was like looking up background information on both of them, and these are men I knew my whole life. I mean, I have some serious background with Father Baumberger, and Father Greenwell married my husband and I. So, but like to and that's the thing too. Like I'm talking about people that I knew. Father Kelly baptized me. Bishop Kelly baptized me.
Wow.
Father Baumberger baptized, I think maybe all three of my kids. Father Greenwell married us. We sat in pre-Cana classes with him for months, like talking. He's a great guy. I just, and this is why I don't want to like talk negatively about people, because if Father Greenwell, if I saw him out on the street, I'd be like, oh my goodness, like so happy to see you.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I would be. It's just kind of the nitty gritty of this stuff that I think people deserve to know. But when Bishop Mendes agrees to ordain these two men, he does it in secret. He denies it later that he ever did it, and he signs a fake name on the ordination paperwork. So that's sort of, if another trad organization did that, the SSPV would be screaming from the rooftops about it. Like, could you imagine, like, if that happened with the FSSP? I mean, they would already say that it would be a mortal sin for anyone to go to an FSSP mass anyway. But
Yeah,
could you
which
imagine if,
blows
like,
my mind, but
could you imagine if that sort of thing was in play? I mean, you'd never hear the end of it.
no, yeah, for sure. Rules for thee, but not for me, perhaps.
Exactly. I think so. And then in 1993, Bishop Kelly gets Bishop Mendes to ordain him a bishop, consecrate him a bishop. And again, it's done in secret. They keep it secret for 2 years. They don't tell it. Bishop Mendes says you can't tell anyone until after my death. And kind of, I think the reason why Bishop Mendes is even in the mix is because his housekeeper slash secretary, this woman named Natalie White, is a very good friend of the Jenkins family, who's the only original priest from the 9 that's still left in the SSPV. I mean, like very close personal
Wow.
friend. Like they go on vacation together and whatnot.
This is so weird,
So,
all the politics of it. Like,
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to call it incestuous, but we're about a generation from being there.
right, right.
um, it just, would Bishop Mendes, I don't think Bishop Mendes would have sought out a traditional organization to sort of, he had already had a stroke. He had been in and out of the hospital with pneumonia. Like, kind of all these things were going on, and there's a lot of people who have said, I mean, and reputable people who are like, he was not in his right mind. We visited him, and he was super confused. Like, he was making inappropriate statements to women that he was coming across, which is something like he never would have done,
Right.
years ago.
Yeah.
That wasn't like his personality or
Right.
anything, things like that. So, you have to wonder sort of what the dynamic was. And then there was a lot of discussion after the fact that perhaps because this was not a man who said a Latin mass ever publicly, so Bishop Mendes, so did he really was the intent there to make a bishop, and was the form and the matter and all of that present? And I'm certainly no theologian and not qualified to speak on that whatsoever, but I know that a lot has been said and written on that topic, enough to muddy the waters. And again, if it was any other group, they'd be
Yeah.
screaming about
Yeah.
it. So that's sort of the the problem.
Quick question from the chat. Do you know if this is the same Father Jenkins who's on YouTube as Jeremiah Alphonsus?
I don't know, but I know Father Jenkins has a Twitter.
Interesting. Okay. How old is Father Jenkins?
He's older. I
Okay.
mean, he's probably, I want to say, early 70s. He has very white hair and glasses.
Okay. Anton, I don't know that Jeremiah Alphonsus YouTube channel. I'll look it up like right now. Um, but if the priest on that channel is not quite old, then I imagine that it's okay.
There is enough.
Yeah, 50 or
There's enough
60.
on YouTube. You can Father Jenkins is very frequently on a channel called What Catholics Believe, um, and that is an SSPV run YouTube channel. So you can
Oh,
kind of see him all the
interesting.
time on that.
Humility.
Yeah. And
It's
like I said, in my travels, I came across his Twitter, and I was like, "That's weird."
I'm looking up. It's called What Catholics Believe.
Yeah, on YouTube.
Okay, I'm just pulling it up just for my own edification right now. I'm not gonna like share my screen or anything like that.
Yeah.
But you know, I just subscribed to it because I'm a masochist. But
Have fun with that.
yeah, okay, okay. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay.
That detour.
No, that's okay. So so Bishop Mendes dies when he's visiting the Cincinnati SSPV group, and craziness ensues. That this was something I was never told at ever. Like we seriously had no clue any of this was going on. Everyone was kind of in jubilation that, oh, we have a bishop now back in 1995. I mean, it was like a huge deal. They activated the phone chain for it, just like to speak about how, what a big deal it was when the announcement came out. But come to find out through my FOIA requests that so Bishop Mendes died on the Cincinnati property, I believe in the rectory. And a few days before he had died, they had him sign some paperwork saying that he wanted to be buried through the SSPV in an SSPV mass and buried in Round Top.
Oh.
And then also an additional document gave his estate, which was considerable, to the SSPV.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So the niece, who is his next of kin, had to travel, I think, from California to Cincinnati and essentially get an injunction to get his body, because they didn't want to give that up. They had it laying in state, or laying, whatever, in the all dressed up in traditional attire, like chasuble and everything. And then eventually she had to go to probate court, but all of that stuff got thrown out, and the judge had like some really harsh words for Father Kelly and Father Jenkins at that time, like essentially, you should be ashamed of yourselves, like, for doing this. And that dragged on for like a couple of weeks. You have to get in and of course this poor man's body is like hanging out in a funeral home during that time. So you have to think, like, it's just kind of, I don't know. But I never would have known any of that had I, like, the FOIA requests came in and I was like, what?
Yeah.
Wacky.
Now, I'm not like super well informed on SSPV stuff, but like I know more than like, your average Catholic does, and I never knew any of that stuff about like the last minute signatures for his estate.
I never knew it either. I mean,
jeez.
Again, and the whole church was like celebrating that we have a bishop now, and Bishop Mendes died, but he made Father Kelly a bishop before he died, and how wonderful. And it's like, and to find out like that was sort of going on behind the scenes at the same time is just like, oh, it's like icky.
Yeah, jeez. And so, sorry, I'm just trying to keep the timeline straight in my head.
Oh yeah, sure.
So when Bishop Mendes died, it was 1995. Okay.
So he actually ordained or consecrated Kelly a bishop in 1993, and then said, "You're not allowed to tell anybody I did it until I
Okay.
die." Yeah,
Okay. And this whole thing is still like the SSPV was like never in communion with Rome during this whole thing,
never,
right? Yeah. Okay.
never.
Yeah.
I mean, they they talk a lot about like who can and can't receive communion there and all of that. That's like an ongoing issue with the group, but it's like coming out of it and seeing the other side of it. Does the Novus Ordo have problems? Yes, tons. The Catholic Church,
Sure.
any
Yeah.
any organization where you have people running it is going to have problems. But it's like it doesn't it doesn't actively hurt the people in the pews most of the time, right? Like I think the onus is on the other side of like, hey, weird stuff might be going on and we might have problems, but like let's make sure that like people get treated okay. And that's what I've seen. I live in the South now, so you know Baptists are the Catholics of the South, and
Right.
you see all the Baptists or the non-denominational Christian churches, and like it's mostly to do things for people. Like that's why they're around, and so you see a lot of that. And just seeing it from the other direction, it was like, no, I don't really see that ever happened with the SSPV. Like they weren't necessarily in it for the people in the pews. I think a lot of times, at least from my perspective, I just a little personal note. So when I made the decision to leave, I kind of sat at home for like several months of Sundays, like paralyzed by fear and dread. And my husband was like, "Hey, these kids are used to going to church every Sunday, so like I'm gonna take them to the regular Catholic church." And so he started doing that, and eventually I went along. And the first time I went, the it was a deacon giving the sermon, and he was talking about essentially um, how like God loves us and like we mess up and like God still loves you.
And you were like,
I was
"What?"
I had this like moment of like I was in this church for like 30 something years, and that was the first time I ever meaningfully heard that God loved me. Like
Yep.
like it was like shocking. Like I had tears pouring down my face. I'm like, this is bonkers. But it was a huge moment of realization for me of like, wow, this is important stuff that, like it's not all about self-flagellation, maybe. And that's pretty cool if it's not.
Yeah. 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 Um it's funny when I made that comment maybe just 10 minutes ago or whatever about because I am a masochist, um my friend Anton said masochism and Catholicism are the same thing. I am partly joking because Anton is Catholic. Um, but so so and 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 we're not at all joking though when we start talking about the SSPV, where like masochism really is just kind of part of what it is to be
Yeah.
trad in that way. It's less true in the SSPX versus the SSPV, and it's even less true in the FSSP than it is in the SSPX. But to
Yeah.
some extent, all of the trad organizations are a little bit masochistic. And I also remember, well, so I remember the first time remembering seeing the sign of peace at a Novus Ordo church. And
Were you freaked out?
yes,
I was too.
because I was um I was old enough. So my family generally went to roughly one Novus Ordo mass a year, I would say. Um and keep in mind I went to mass 6 days a week. So
Right.
you can imagine that I'm going to 100, like I'm going to 350 or whatever traditional Latin masses to one Novus Ordo mass. Um and the first time that I remember going to a Novus Ordo mass, and like the first time I remember being old enough there and seeing the sign of peace, it freaked me out a little bit because I thought it was like, well, I guess I was like scandalized by it, right? I probably
Yeah.
thought that it was like inappropriate. But then I remember seeing it again, like a couple years later, and being like, wait, no, this is actually like super cool. Like, imagine just telling your neighbor, I love you. What? Like, we do not do this in my Catholicism, you know?
Um, to get back to the masochism, you made me think of like this has literally not been in my brain for probably like 20 years. So, thank you
You're welcome.
or not for this. So, the first place that they had the school was actually they rented it from a Lutheran church
Okay.
in Wantagh, New York on Long Island. And so they used the classrooms, and we had gym around the corner in the parking lot, and then but there was an actual gym upstairs, and we would go to mass in the gym. Now,
Wow.
folding chairs and gym floors. So someone had donated carpet squares for us to kneel on. So you'd go in, there'd be the boxes of carpet squares, you'd take a carpet square and you'd kneel on it for mass. But like it was super encouraged to like not take a carpet square, like to just like kneel on the gym floor. And like you were
Jeez.
definitely like got a little pat on the head if you like just chose to kneel on the gym floor. And like this are elementary schoolers, kind of being encouraged to do that. And I just thought of that and I was like, oh, that's like not great. But again, no one ever told me like you're holier if you don't take a carpet square. But it was definitely like it's this background noise that exists of like,
The only thing that I can think of that's like that is what mass was it? And see, you can tell how long it's been for me since I've been like a real Catholic. It's been like 5 years. What mass was it where you go from the actual like altar to like we went to the basement of our church? Is that Holy Thursday?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's like the altar of repose.
Yes, the altar of repose. Wow, thank you. Completely forgot that term. Um, when we did that, the altar of repose was just in the basement of the church, and so there were no pews or anything, so nobody was sitting. You were either standing or kneeling, and it was very much so like, hey, this is the one mass a year. You will kneel on the cement floor of the basement.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and it was just like a offer it up. Like, yes,
Yeah.
it's gonna suck. Your knees will be
Yeah.
sore.
Yeah.
Offer it up.
Yeah.
That was very much so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was like, but like stuff, there was a lot of stuff like that existed, especially in the school. The school was like a different level because then you were kind of hardcore SSPV 24/7. And, some nuns were like super fun and nice and whatever, and some nuns like weren't. Or, as an adult and someone who was a teacher, I have to think now that like maybe they weren't really suited to being teachers and like they kind of didn't like it because not everyone it's not for everyone.
Yup.
So, you have to wonder like what personally was going on with nuns who maybe weren't all that nice. But I remember one nun in particular. So what would happen is you would have either mass or rosary every day and then lunch after. So you can imagine like all these kids are starving by the time we get back into the classroom. But we weren't allowed to eat until we said grace. You had to sit there with your lunchbox until the nun came in to like lead you in grace. And if you ate, if you started eating, like trying to eat your sandwich beforehand, there was one nun and she would come in and she'd shake you by the collar and she'd go, say grace or you'll choke.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
Was she being serious?
Yeah, I think so. Probably, yeah.
Because like my family always had a joke because one of my younger siblings one time said, "Can we say grace again? Like we said grace before meals." And he goes, "Can we say grace again?" My parents were like, "Why?" He's like, "Because my food is still hot." And they were like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Well, grace is what cools down your food." And my parents were like, "That's not true." um, so I was like, maybe this nun was kidding. Like maybe she was like, "Yeah, like you say your grace so you don't choke." But
Probably not.
okay.
Yeah, probably not.
Oh dear. Okay.
But I mean, and I don't know if this is still the case, but in the Wayback Machine when I was there, you know, you had to sign a waiver saying corporal punishment was okay, and it was
Whoa.
utilized. Um, Not a ton, not every day, but it was there enough that you knew that that was a distinct possibility. And there were a few times that it was used publicly, like as an example was being made of a particular person. So,
Jeez.
so it was definitely, and again, I don't know if that's still the case. They may have done away with that, but, when I was there, which would have been like 1994 to 2000, that was definitely still in play then
Um,
in the school.
I went to the same FSSP affiliated school that my dad did.
Okay.
There was corporal punishment when my dad was there. There was not when I was there.
Right.
So maybe it's similar with the SSPV, and maybe they got rid of it in recent years. I'm not sure.
I don't know either.
Yeah,
I don't know personally anyone who has kids still there who I would feel comfortable asking. So I do not know the answer to
yeah,
that. But
yeah.
yeah,
No,
that
I
was
mean I wouldn't ask you. I wouldn't. Yeah,
definitely like, hey, are they still hitting kids at that
yeah,
school?
that's right. Yeah, hey, totally random.
Do they still have that paddle hanging up? Because like, yeah. So yeah, I mean, essentially that's kind of the timeline that's in play. He and Kelly announced he was a bishop in 1995, and then 1996 he kind of does this thing that still confuses me, which was announcing that the SSPV is still a thing, but now there's going to be the congregation of the Society of St. Pius V.
Yeah, I don't get that. What?
So I think it has to do with ordaining priests.
Okay.
And the reason I think that is because obviously it happens right after he becomes a bishop. He starts ordaining priests kind of very quickly. And I think that it's a way to keep the new priests in a more like the priests who are there, like obviously it's Father Kelly, it was Bishop Kelly, then Father Jenkins, Father Bomberger, Father Greenwell, Father Skierke, Father Marachka, right? So there's like 6 of them that exist now. They were the original SSPV guys, or not the original, but they're the ones who still exist that are SSPV. All of the younger priests that have since been ordained by Bishop Kelly are, they'll sign their name CSPV. And I think
Congregation.
that there's more, yeah, I think there's more rules for them. Like, I think, like, for example, you know, Father Bomberger could go off and start his own thing, right? Like, he wouldn't because he's been there forever, but like, he could. Like, there's not any kind of strict thing holding him there. But I think the new priests, and again, unless I drive to Round Top and knock on the door and ask for them, I don't know what you know,
Right.
their constitutions are. I don't know what vows they make. So I think it's kind of a way to have more control over the newer priests. That's my understanding of it
Jeez.
anyway. And
Jeez.
there's a lot of new priests. I mean, they're cranking them out.
Yeah. I've looked at statistics for the FSSP, and it does seem like the vocations are not lacking in the FSSP.
No.
I'm sure it's the same in the SSPV too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot. And I remember even like the girls I went, obviously the school is super small. It was even smaller when I went there. I didn't graduate from my class because I got pregnant and they decided I should probably continue my education elsewhere. But they, of the graduating class I would have had, there was maybe 10 of us. And out of those, like probably 3 went into the convent, 2 went into the seminary. So like that's a lot, you know, in terms of percentage wise. And I'm not, yeah. And I mean, I'm sure that they would say you're exposed to the traditional sacraments, so you have more of a love and respect for it. So you're more likely to realize what your vocation is. And aren't you sad for all the people who might have a vocation and never act on it?
That's
Right.
right. That's right. I always heard that too. I don't know about you, but we actually heard that 1 in 10 like boys have a vocation in the priesthood. 1 in 10. That is what we hear. No, sorry, that's not the priesthood. That is are called to the religious life. So
Right.
that's inclusive of priests, but as well as monks and the rest.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of like, I don't know. I don't know. I definitely, and again, this is my personal opinion. I definitely felt like more like certain people were pushed towards particularly the nuns. And again, I'm a girl, so girls have conversations. Like I was very surprised when some people went into the,
Mm.
you know, went into the cloister. I was very surprised by that.
Well, I mean, I am not surprised that it works in the sense that, like, when you were talking about that nun who was 22 and you were like, well, she wasn't an adult because she was 22. I was 22 when I got strong armed into getting married.
Yeah.
So I don't think that 22-year-olds are like adults yet, Like when you're 20, sure, you're more of an adult at 22 than you are when
Right.
you're 18, but you're
Right.
22.
Yeah.
I was a
Yeah.
I'm still a kid, And when I was 22, I was even more of a kid. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think like it kind of all goes towards, I'll say I very much hesitate to ever use the word cult. I think it's an overused word, and I think it has connotations that don't necessarily apply here. But I will call it a high control group. Um, I think that is more on point. Can you leave? Sure. Uh, will your family not speak to you for a while if you do? Probably, yeah. Like, will there be repercussions for you? Yes, like that are very difficult to deal with, and it's rough, and these things happen, and you're like, you kind of look back and like I'll say things to my husband that seem like perfectly normal and standard to me, and he's like, what? um so one of the things I from a personal standpoint that I wanted to touch on was, I got pregnant when I was 17, and they were like, yeah, you can't stay in this school. And I wouldn't really expect them to be like, yeah, sure, no problem, be pregnant, let's let out the uniform for you, that's fine. But when I was pregnant, my grandmother was kind of insistent, like, you need to go to confession before the baby's born, right? Because they told me not to go to mass, that I would create a scandal by going to mass when I was pregnant.
Of course.
Yeah. So she kind of like made me this appointment to go and go to confession. And that's what all I thought it was. And I was kind of like making my grandmother happy. So I go up there, drive up there with her. She's like, the priest is already in there. Just go into the confessional, do your confession. So I go in, I go to confession, and he says to me, please meet me downstairs in the conference room. And I'm like, okay. Again, I'm 17. I am used to doing what people tell me to do.
That's
Like,
right. A priest
there's a
says
lot of
something,
that.
you do it.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I'd never had a one-on-one conversation with any of the priests. Like, they're up here and like you're down here. Like, I wouldn't have like a one-on-one conversation. And so I go downstairs and they were like, hey, the priest is like, we've organized an adoption for your child. Like,
Whoa.
I was like, no. And it got really, it got, there was name calling, like, from him to me, like, you're, a stupid, selfish girl, and how can you do this to your family? And we have this nice Catholic family that wants to adopt your baby, and like, you're going to do him such a disservice by saying no, and like all of this. And I like sat there mute. I was like, I had no idea this was going to happen. And apparently my mom and my grandmother had no idea that this was in the works either. Like, this was something that was configured completely outside of the whole situation. So I was like, you know, kind of walked out, and my grandmother's like, you good? Let's go to breakfast. And I'm like sweating and shaking. And my mom ended up calling like the rectory and basically leaving a message of like, hey, my daughter will not be adopting her baby out, like, she's fine, thank you for your concern. um so yeah. But you have to wonder, like, it made, again, not at the time, but it made me wonder, like, how many other times has stuff like this happened? Like, it didn't seem like the first time that conversation was had. I, of course, didn't feel ever comfortable saying that to anyone, for a very long time. Like, my mom knew, again, my husband eventually knew that had happened, but like, you wonder how many times those things happen, or like marriages that are low key arranged, like that aren't really arranged. Like, you have to marry this person, but it's like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if you guys had some, you're both unmarried and you're 25, best,
Chop chop.
you know, chop chop, exactly.
The fact that they just went ahead and they did this to me means that they thought that they would get their way. Like they wouldn't just go through the whole process if they were like, there's no way that she's gonna go along with this.
Yeah,
Which
and when you think about it, like phone calls needed to be made, like things needed, this wasn't just like it wasn't a conversation where it was like, hey, we can do this for you if this is something that you're looking into, like, maybe you want to explore a different avenue. It was like, this has been discussed. We have people, you know, it's done.
yeah. And I let me ask you a question. Was this kind of approached through an angle of like this is going to reduce scandal in the community?
I took it that way because I had already been asked not to like appear publicly.
Yep.
Like, um,
Exact same thing happened to me.
yeah,
Not
really.
well, so I nobody no nobody got pregnant, but I was dating my at the time girlfriend for 5 years, and I was just gonna like I told I was like, look, I'm not Catholic anymore. Like I don't believe the same stuff that you guys do, and we're moving. Like we're moving out. We're moving together. Um, and it was made clear to me that like, well, this is so scandalous that you're not part of the family anymore unless you get married first. And I
Right,
was 22, so I
right,
went along with it. And
right.
so was I forced into a marriage? I don't know. Like, does that word forced apply? I don't know. Because in some senses I was 22 and I did agree. But what kind of
Yeah,
decision was that? Like what
right.
um and the threat of scandal. I think that if you don't grow up in the insular communities that we did, like scandal doesn't really make sense to you. You're kind of like, who cares what everyone else thinks about you? But when
Right.
when your whole life exists in this tiny little community and you're told your entire community will hate you
Yeah.
if you like it
And
does
there's
something
a
to you.
fear of like being the person who's stepping out of line, and there's like, and it's made to be that. So like, for example, I remember going to confession before mass once and being told that I needed to do the Stations of the Cross for my penance, and I needed to go out and do it right then. So I walked out and did the Stations of the Cross publicly. Was that a public penance? Well, I view it as, because I walked out of the confessional and everyone's kneeling in the pews waiting for mass to start, and I'm doing the Stations of the Cross silently around the church. Like, that's public, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, you never, and then that happens, and you're like, I never want that to happen again. How do I avoid that? I had a friend who was refused communion at the communion rail because she was supposedly immodestly dressed. Now, she had was a large chested girl and had trouble getting clothes that, and so she was showing a little bit of cleavage, but the priest stopped, looked, and went right past her. When something like that happens, like, you never, the shame is so intense that you never want to feel that again. So you're like, okay, what can I do to stay in line to never feel that again?
Yeah.
um
It's part of human psychology, I think, that like we're just super averse to shaming, and
yeah,
and I don't think that people who didn't grow up in communities like ours understand how intense the shaming can be in a community like
right.
ours. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I agree 100%. Like, um I had been speaking on another forum about, that the convent and the seminary are like very high control as they exist right now. And someone was sort of arguing with me and saying, well, I can go to Round Top and go to mass any Sunday and talk to whatever nun or priest I want. It's like, okay, maybe you can, but like, someone from Montana can't. And if their daughter is in the convent, they're not allowed to get letters. The letters are read that go out. They're allowed to have phone calls at certain points in the year. Like, they can't just like go to the deli, right? Like, so in that sense, they are, that's very different even than, and I would say, I would go so far as to say even pre-Vatican II seminaries did not function like that, in terms of these people were free to go home in the summer, right? They were free to go get a haircut, at the barber of their choosing. Um, the people who are in the SSPV seminary at this point are not permitted to do that. So that's not great. Like, that's trouble. It's troubling to me, that exists, and that you can't really access people's true, what they're feeling, I guess, about it.
Yeah, it's evident to me that there is some element of, um, hold on. I want to be careful with how I phrase this.
Yes.
Um, I think that oftentimes the kinds of people who form these reactionary movements are often the kinds of people who enjoy having positions of power over other people. Priests in trad culture are not treated like priests in regular Novus Ordo Catholic culture.
No.
Priests in trad culture are like rock stars. They're superstars. You kind of just do whatever they tell you.
Yeah.
Um, I'm actually like shocked that you had the guts to say no to a priest when you were 17.
I was just like gonna be a mom, like it was my baby,
Right, right,
like
right.
I had already thought about adoption and been like, no, you know what, we can do this. This is cool. We're fine. My son's probably watching this now, so he's gonna be like, thanks, mom.
Hi, son. I'm glad it worked out. Like, I'm glad that these priests weren't able to bully you into adopting your son away. That's insane to even say. But,
Yeah. And
geez.
like, it's just, it's bonkers, because the things that they get away with, and to sort of, go back to that idea of like, culturally, the culture they create, right, is one where you're very afraid to go against the grain, and then you get out and you're like, oh, okay, like, let me acclimate to this new normal, and what the heck happened to me for the last however many years, and trying to, kind of step into a really good example, a couple of really good examples, one of which is, so, and I'm laughing, my grandfather was dying, actively dying. He was in hospice, and I had already left the group, and everybody knew that I had already left. It was like, pretty, it was out there.
That's how it happens.
And
Yeah.
I got the phone call. Like, we had been back and forth to hospice and whatnot, but like, we got the phone call very, very, very early one morning of like, it's time, he's going. So I throw on, I had like leggings and like a big sweatshirt or something, get in the car, drive down to the hospice, and nuns and like a priest are in the room saying the rosary or whatever. So I walk in, I kind of stand in the back, praying along with everybody. And someone, I'm not going to say who, someone pulls me out of the room and goes, how dare you show up attired like that when you knew the priest was going to be here? And I looked around and I realized like all the other women were wearing like stockings and long skirts. And I'm like, it is 5 a.m. I'm going to see my grandfather who's passing away. Like, he doesn't care how I'm dressed. And that was like, if the priest was going to be there or the nuns were going to be there, like, you had to dress just so. Did you experience that in the FSSP? Like, is it that strict with that
Um,
kind of dress code stuff?
two thoughts here. The first thing that comes to my mind is I I am a male, so it is different for men.
Right,
Like we boys had pressure to like look presentable, but it's not the same, right? Like
right.
we were never I was gonna say we were never going to tempt the priests to impurity. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but okay, I'm gonna move on from that. But
Well,
we
kind of not moving on from that. One thing I will say for the SSPV that does not exist in other groups like that is that I never heard anything along those lines. I mean, There was nothing, not a rumor, not a whisper. It doesn't exist. So to that, I would have to speak favorably because, again, you do have these high control groups, and that aspect is very much something you hear over and over again. And like, it was not like I have absolutely no reason to think anything untoward with any of that ever went on. So, I will speak positively to that.
I'm glad. And I thought the same thing about the FSSP, but the recent case of Father James Jackson,
I heard
who,
about
by the way, like admitted guilt a few days ago, like a week ago or
that.
something, admitted guilt in the CP case.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I saw that.
and also, there's a priest who, like, on bishopaccountability.org or whatever, his
Mhm.
status is sued because I know that he's been sued for
Mm,
for assaulting a minor.
right.
Now I don't know if that one's true or not, but I do know that
Right.
Father James Jackson admitted. So
Right.
anyway, I would have said like a few years ago, I would have even just 3 years ago, I would have said no
Right.
way, that's not in the FSSP. But I hope that you're right. Like I hope you are.
I would think at this point there would have at least been a rumor or something floating around if that was the case. I have no reason
Okay,
to
good,
think
good,
any of that. Yeah.
good. Um, yeah, but what I was saying was that us boys were never given the pressure that the girls were because we
Right.
had to look presentable, but we were never going to tempt anybody to sin. For the
Right.
girls, it was different. Now we were generally, so our school uniform was, skirts with stockings for the women.
Yeah.
For the boys, it was, we had a tie and a button down and trousers.
Yeah.
Um, but there would be some women in pants at Sunday
Okay.
Mass. So, like, I'm thinking of people about, like, I've got an aunt who, like, married into traditionalism. Um,
Okay.
and so she wouldn't wear a chapel veil and she would wear pants.
Okay.
And she would also wear skirts sometimes too. Like,
Right.
like any other woman, like, she wore
Right.
what she wanted to wear. But she would wear pants. Um, and she wasn't told that she wasn't allowed to be there or anything like that. So I think that
So I have watched ushers escort women out of mass. Like
wow,
like I can speak to that. Like I've seen that with my own.
jeez,
Yeah, I have
for
seen.
wearing pants.
Oh yeah, yeah, yep. Like you're not properly attired. There's a big sign at the front doors of the SSPV chapel I went to that is like this is the dress code, and it says women need to be in skirts below the knee, shirts above the collarbone, no tank tops, no like it's very very specific.
Wow,
So, yeah, it's and head coverings. So um,
mandatory chapel veils.
mandatory,
Okay,
mandatory.
they were only ever pseudo mandatory
Okay,
in. Oh, and I have a thing with chapel veils that I want to run past you real quick. But
sure.
so chapel veils were pseudo mandatory in the sense that um, they were given to everybody. Like if you didn't
Okay,
have one, they would be given to you, and it was like you could put this on now, but like if you didn't, and there were a few women who were just like, yeah, it's not for me, um, and like they were never escorted out.
yeah,
Um,
you would have been asked to leave
okay,
to the point where when you get married or when there's something like where people who might not be from the group are coming in, um, you're given little slips of paper to put in your wedding invitations about the dress code.
whoa,
And that
wow,
like you will be asked to wear a head covering, like so that people aren't, I guess, surprised by it or asked to leave. Like so they have like when you're getting married, um like it's one of the things you're given. And the wedding dresses also have to be run by, and bridesmaid dresses have to be run by the priest who's going to be marrying you.
yeah. Why am I surprised? I guess. Um, I've got a question for you though.
Sure.
So I never thought about this until recently, but I think that chapel veils kind of do the opposite of what they're supposed to do in the modern age. Um, the point of chapel veils historically was to not draw attention to like your hair, and your hair was
Right.
supposed to be, kind of like,
Right.
your crowning jewel. Um, but like modern chapel veils, first of all, they don't hide your hair, right? They're totally see
No.
through. Um, and I think what they really are is just kind of just like, look how pious I am. You know what I mean?
Sometimes, by again having been in various forms of kind of like all different, like up and down Catholic culture. I mean, I can probably say that I've been in like every type of Catholic
You've done it
culture and
all.
beliefs, right? I've done it all. And like I did know women who like genuinely felt like they were personally led like to cover their hair. Like, and it was very genuine on their part. Like they felt like that was like a personal devotion, I guess, right? And okay, fine. The problem comes when you're telling everyone that it all has to be this way, to the point of like, I remember one Sunday, um, oh,
So I didn't
funny
mean to
thing,
interrupt you. I just thought this was a
oh
good
yeah,
point.
funny thing, biblically speaking, the veil, this was purely, yeah, I mean, sure, I think like anything else, it's, we probably don't understand what the original point of it was, but I personally have worn a tissue on my head in church when they ran out of chapel veils in the free chapel veil box.
Uh,
So,
that would happen to girls at school,
oh,
um, because so when I say that it was pseudo mandatory, it was actually mandatory when you were a student at the school,
right,
and you're going to daily mass. Like during daily mass, like you had to, you didn't have a choice,
right.
and if you forgot your chapel veil that day, that's fine. Go grab one from the bin of free chapel veils. If there's none left, tissue. So that did
Yeah.
happen.
Yes, that is a real thing.
Yep.
And even to the point of like, I remember, so like certain days, like so Corpus Christi was always on a Thursday in the old calendar, and so the girls would be excused from school and brought over to the church where Corpus Christi was going to be, so that we could like do the flowers and like polish the silver and whatever and get it ready for Corpus Christi. And like I have a very vivid memory of having to like walk through the back of the church from like one side to the other rather than walk around the entire outside of it. And no one was there. Like there was no people there, and being like, oh, do I have to cover my head? If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to see it, does it make a sound? But still putting my hand on my head to like run through the back of the church.
Wow.
And like, like I said, there was this woman I knew who was like very personally devoted to covering her hair in front of the Eucharist. Fine. Like she definitely was. She understood. This woman understood the meaning behind it, right? Like she's a Novus Ordo Catholic who decided to do this thing. There's no meaning. Like no one ever told me why I was doing this, running through the back of the of the chapel. Um, so I think there's like a disconnect sometimes between, or a lot of times between, and what you're doing and why.
Yeah.
And
It
that even goes back. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the doing it kind of becomes why you're doing it. Like you just do it to do it. Like that why? Because
Yeah.
that's just what we do. Like
Yes.
that kind of becomes the end unto itself for a lot
Yeah.
of these like weird devotional things.
Yeah. I think so. I think that's really safe to say. Um, and they, in terms of all of that, like the refusing communion, the public stuff, you kind of have to wonder if, at a certain point, and again, my personal opinion, how much of it is just to kind of keep everyone right here, like don't go
Yes.
over here, don't go over there, like right here.
And to set you apart from everyone else too.
Yeah.
Like
And the school is like a different beast a lot of the times. I'm sure you can speak to that in terms of the SSP school versus like the regular people in the pews at a mass who just go there on
yes.
Sundays.
Yep.
The school is like intense.
Yeah.
And to the point of like, yeah, it's very intense. And I don't know what degree that is now. But yeah, definitely high control. It's more so. It's you don't want people leaving. You want to keep them in line, I
Did
think.
was there like a SSPV school versus SSPV homeschool like divide?
No.
Okay, so there
No.
was one at my FSSP church.
Was there
Yeah,
really?
it's
Oh,
it,
that's
like the
interesting.
people who went to the school thought that they were better for doing FSSP school, but the people who did the homeschooling thought that they were better for homeschooling. So there was like a cultural divide at the church between the homeschoolers and
So I didn't know anyone who had access to the school that homeschooled.
okay,
Like it wasn't a thing. Like
interesting. Okay,
if you could send your kid to the school, why would you homeschool? You know, um, there was definitely judgment for people. Like I remember there was one family whose like son was like super gifted in sports. Like that was going to be his ticket like to life, was that he was really good. SSPV doesn't have any sports teams, and the parents made the choice to pull him out and put him. I don't know. I don't remember if it was in diocesan Catholic school or public school. This was a long time ago, and the blowback they got was like unreal. Even to the point of like, I remember them being like, "This is my child's future. Like, this is what this is what's going to get him a free ride to college." He was that good at whatever sport it was, and like there was, well, what about his soul?
right. What? Who cares about his
Yeah,
career? Who cares about his school prospects? His soul is more important. That was the exact attitude that we had at our
yeah,
school too.
yeah.
Um, I want to tell you a little bit about my school too, because my family actually got some of that exact same blowback for a different reason. But before I do that, there's a certain Nick who says that he's a little behind, but thanks for not adopting me out, mom. So when Nick catches up, he'll see me pulling up this comment. But um, so the school that the FSSP school, it was first through eighth and high school, like 9 through 12.
Yeah.
I didn't go to the high school. None of my family did. We all went to the public high school.
Huh.
Why? Because the high school, so the grammar school and middle school did a fine enough job for the most part. But keep in mind that the people who were teaching there were not teachers. Almost none of them held teaching degrees. Most of them were just moms, right? Like they were like my
Right.
friends' parents, right? They some of
Right.
lots of them didn't even go to college, um, and so they were doing their best. But by eighth grade, we were behind on math. Um, so I actually wound up taking double math when I was in eighth grade. I
Oh wow.
took math I took pre-algebra with the eighth graders, but then I also, on my own time, took algebra by I walked upstairs to the high school, and at the end of the day, the algebra teacher in the high school would just tell me what chapter they were on, and I would just have to read it. And he would like hand me like a test, and he'd be like, "Okay, like complete this," and I'd do it in 15 minutes and give it to him. He'd be like, "All right, you're good." And
Right.
so I wound up doing algebra and pre-algebra at the same time, which makes no sense because like, why do I have to
No,
do
it's a
pre-algebra if
foundational thing. It should be, yeah.
right? So I remember getting to the end of the pre-algebra book and being like, "This is what I was working on at the beginning of the semester or at the beginning of the school year." But anyway, I did that so that I could go to a public high school and not be a year behind on math.
Right.
And my my dad's an engineer, like so. I think that he understood the importance of education, and I'm so grateful that they sent me to a public school. Um,
So I will say, again, this is speaking to SSPV school ending around the year 2000. So, like, I don't know what they're doing now. I have no clue. I will say I got an excellent education in English and
same,
math.
really.
Math, I mean, it was beyond me. I pretty much failed, but like the math teacher that was the nun who taught math, high school math, had been, before going into the convent, had been a math professor, I want to say, or something.
Wow.
And she knew what she was doing. It was lost on me because I'm genetically horrible at math. But like it was there. What I'll say is almost no social studies in any meaningful way, almost no science in any meaningful way. The science textbook, they had pages glued together in them.
to,
So as
to
not
prevent you
to
from
like
learning some stuff.
teach too much biology.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and then so again, don't know if this is still the case, but back in the day, the high school social studies textbook was called Christ the King, Lord of History.
A great title.
Great. And taught I mean, it was like, and this is what it started at Abraham and
Sorry.
um, went through the Spanish Civil War. Um, but like it hit like topics of church significance, I guess, like
And I'm sure
Catholic
that
Church.
it was pro nationalist for the Spanish Civil War. I'm sure pro
Yes.
Franco.
So actually, my sister and I were just recently talking about this, and I'm like, "Do you have this memory of like this thing?" And she was like, "Oh my gosh, yes." Essentially, we were all told this story about the Spanish Civil War of like this general, and he was on the good side, the Franco side, and he his son was going to be killed because they wanted him to surrender whatever city he was holding, and they had the young son who was like 11 or 12 call his father and be like, "Papa, they're going to shoot me." And he was like, "Say a good act of contrition, my son, I'll see you in heaven." And like they ended the phone call and they shot the kid, and like we were told like what a wonderful like example that was of everything.
Jeez.
But I called my sister because it popped into my head as I've been doing all the prep work for this, and I was like, is this real? And I'll often have those feelings of like these weird fever dream things, and I'll have to, it's me, it was my brother and my sister. My brother passed away 10 years ago, but like, kind of that feeling of like having to call someone and be like, did this really happen or no? And my
I
sister was like, yes.
I go through that same thing, and sometimes I like. I've got a friend who went through the same school that I did and everything, and sometimes he'll be like, "Do you remember when Mrs. So and So in fifth grade said this, that, and the other?" And I'll be like, "Yes, yes, I do remember that," but like I didn't remember it until now because it's so
Right.
crazy. Like
Yeah.
like I'm talking about like slavery apologetics, crazy.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And yeah, yes, yes, yes,
Okay,
yes. Of like a lot of that, a lot of like not Holocaust denying, but a lot of Holocaust minimizing.
really?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, I don't think that we went that far. We didn't go as far as denying the Holocaust. We only went as far as saying that slavery was actually pretty okay and pretty cool. Um, yeah, and like that women shouldn't vote and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think so. I want to hear more about the Holocaust stuff. What exactly did they tell you?
So I was told, and again, a lot of this was like extemporaneous of like the nuns or the teachers like telling us things like in the midst of whatever the real lesson was. Um, but like I was definitely told that like not as many Jews died in the Holocaust as they say, and that it like as many Catholics died in the Holocaust as Jews, like for defending the Jews.
Yes, we were definitely taught that as well. That like,
Yeah.
well, don't forget that like, a lot of Catholics died too.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
I don't think that we were saying that like the numbers are inflated on the numbers of Jews killed or anything like that. I think we were just told like don't forget about the Catholics, like And there
Yeah.
was also a lot about Pope Saint Pius the
12.
12th. Thank you. I almost said 10th, but I'm like nope,
No.
that is 20 or 30 years too early. Um, yeah, Pope Saint Pius the 12th, and how he personally was like hiding Jews in the Vatican and stuff, which turns out like if you actually look into I'm gonna make a fool of myself right now, but like he did a little bit of cozying up with the Nazis. It turns out, like he
Yeah.
wasn't the hero that I was taught that he was. I also don't think that he's the villain that other people make him out to be.
You know what? I think he was a politician.
Yes,
That's what I think.
precisely.
and
Yeah.
I think that through most of church history, that's what popes were meant to be. And I think that sometimes judging people who lived way back when through the lens of what we know to be right or true now is, and that's coming from someone who used to teach history.
Yeah.
So, you
Oh,
know,
so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
no,
off.
no.
I've got questions for you about history and like the SSPV school and stuff like
Oh
that.
yeah, sure.
Our history books, I'll never forget. We had a history book that ended on the note that, yeah, like more and more families are getting televisions, and maybe one day every family will have a television in their home.
Yes, super, super dated textbooks, really dated. And
You too?
so, yeah, so we had to go to a book depository to get our textbooks in the beginning of the year because like they didn't have the textbooks, so you had to like be issued them by the school district of or the county or whatever. So at a certain point, the books that they wanted to use like weren't like the school district was like, hey, you have to stop using these books. Like these books are completely outdated and probably wrong. So they started making copies of the books and like binding them
Oh,
themselves.
wow.
Yeah, so like I remember like my phonics book was like was like self-printed situation. I think like certain language books because as you can imagine, like when you're learning Spanish or French or whatever, there's like lots of illustrations, you know, in like a kid's. And so they didn't like the illustrations because it turned like it was like girls wearing pants and things like that.
Yeah, evil.
So they needed the old books that showed all the girls wearing skirts from like 1940. And at a
Right.
certain point, the school district was like, yeah, we're not going to use that book anymore.
That's so
So yeah,
funny.
like super, super old um, books. Now, where did you guys draw like was there a lot of like, hey, you shouldn't have a TV, you shouldn't watch TV, like a lot of that kind of thing?
Yes. And it was very common for families to have TVs, but to not have cable.
Okay.
You would just have like a VHS player, and your parents would allow certain VHSs into the house. So yeah, it's totally fine to go ahead and watch Snow White since that came out in the 1930s. But anything that came out after the year
Right.
1962, whatever, like that's not allowed. That was fairly
I mean,
common.
I do remember a really huge like fire and brimstone sermon from probably when I was like 9 or 10 of like I know that a lot of you guys have TVs and you have cable and you're letting your kids watch them and you should all go home and throw them away. And
Yeah.
like a lot of people did. Like a lot of people did. Um it and my parents were like a little bit more laid back at home, I think, than other. But I do remember another family who was like a like high donation, high like they were very involved in a lot of different ways. I remember the dad like walking out and him making a comment of like, I'm still gonna watch my football or like whatever on Sundays. Like
Yeah.
so there was that. And then even though this is after me, I feel like I can speak to it because I still had like cousins and stuff in the school. When the internet really became a thing, I mean, that was like banned to the point that trying to think of the to the point that at least 6 or 7 years ago, it was still not allowed. And some like from the people in the school. So like when you if your kid went to the school, you had to sign a waiver saying you wouldn't allow them internet in the home. To the
Wow,
point
even 6 or 7 years
that
ago?
yeah, to the point that someone I know very well who went to the school, who graduated around that time, I had to help her set up an email account because she like had for college because she had no clue like what is the internet, what is email, like she didn't know. And at that point like shared Google Docs and things are like a thing, you know, and she had no idea how to do any of it and it put her at a real disadvantage going into college. I don't know if they've changed that or not.
So when the internet came out in the FSSP, there was definitely a lot of like, you guys should not be having this. Now, just to give you perspective, I was born in '95,
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm young.
Okay.
Um, but the internet started becoming a thing. What, like a thing that like everyone could have in their homes when I was 10 or something like that,
Right.
right? So I remember the sermons against the um I remember the sermons against the internet, and we also didn't get internet in my house. And we were a fairly late adopting family for getting internet. Especially Wi-Fi. We were very late on getting Wi-Fi. We had um internet that went to the family computer, and the family computer was like public, right? Like,
Yeah.
nobody was using it privately,
Right.
and we had it like that for a while. um yeah, but like we had the internet, I guess. We were just like slow to adopt.
Okay. Well, I know that at my last contact with anyone who would know anything about this, which again would probably be like 6, 7 years ago, People who are in the school, part of like the documents that you sign when you agree to have your kid in the school is like no access to internet at home, like no access to internet on their phones. So like no Instagram, no Facebook, no Snapchat, like none of that. They wouldn't be allowed to have any of that. Now, do some of them?
Almost definitely. Almost definitely. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, um, I have one comment that I want to bring up just
Sure.
because I think that TK41 didn't. I think he just started watching now because he says, "Are there any serious issues in the SSPV, or is it just mommy and daddy didn't let you watch rated R movies?" I might suggest that you watch from the beginning, TK421. I might suggest that you watch from the beginning.
Yeah. I
Um,
was allowed to watch rated R movies sometimes. So,
yeah, like The Passion of the Christ, for instance.
like Braveheart.
Hey, there you go. Yeah. Actually, Mel Gibson is totally fine, right? Anything that Mel Gibson
Totally
touches is
fine.
fine.
Even though he's SSPX, so he wouldn't be allowed to receive communion at the SSPV, but we can watch his movies.
Okay, all right. Hey, you'll take your wins where you can get them. Um,
Yeah.
I have a question, another history question for you, if that's all right. I remember our history videos. Now, sorry, no, I said videos. Our history books. Our history books. I remember it now as being super revisionist. At the time, though, I obviously didn't think anything of it because that's just what I learned. But like thinking back on it, we were only taught things through a very like Catholic lens. Like so,
Yes.
for instance, like Cortez, like maybe he did maybe he was a little heavy-handed, but he brought Catholicism to the New World, and
Yes.
for that we should, Cortez should be canonized. That not literally, but like kind of.
A
Um,
100%. And that's another thing. Like, so, which I was gonna touch on. So English and math, stellar. I got to college and I was like, this is so easy. Like, please. As far as writing, I was taught to like, cite an MLA in high school,
yep.
like, which is something that like other people who are coming from public school backgrounds had to be taught. Like that was a whole class of how to do that, and I was like sleeping through it because I'm like, this is I learned this in ninth grade. What are we doing? Like we read a lot of classic literature, all of that stuff. So and supposedly math, had I been able to do it, would have been fine. But the history stuff was like shocking to me because I remember sitting in my history class, my college history classes, like just Western Civ 1, and being like, what? The Greeks? What? Being like absolutely blown away by all of that. And that was why I decided to become a history teacher, because I was like, I cannot believe any of this really happened. Like it was a shock to me in the same way that, leaving or starting to leave the SSPV, it was like a shock that there was like Novus Ordo Catholics who were like decent, regular people, like holy and kind and doing their best out there in the world. Like that was shocking to me that it, you know, that they would be, that if they walked into my church, they would not be allowed to participate in mass in any meaningful way. They would be turned away from communion and probably asked to leave if they were wearing like regular street clothes. You know, that was like, it's just a complete reversion of your revision of your whole worldview, because you learn this for like years and years and years and you're immersed in it.
Your whole life.
And then you turn around and you're like, oh my gosh, like you mean I didn't need to prepare at all times for martyrdom? Like, what?
Do you remember wishing to be martyred?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that. I
Yes.
remember. I remember. So I remember a few things. Um, I remember wishing for martyrdom and thinking like, man, like, because then that would just, like if I don't get martyred, that means I actually have to like stick it out through like an entire lifetime. And like, if I do stick it out through an entire lifetime, like, it's not even certain that I'm gonna go to heaven. Like, I would much rather just get martyred. Like that. That's
Yeah,
like the easy street. Um,
I know.
and then I also remember hearing, so I went like the chapel that I grew up in was Our Lady of Fatima, so just the whole Fatima thing was just a very big thing for us. I'm sure it was for you too.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but I remember being jealous of Sister Lucia's cousins, Jacinta and Francisco,
Yeah, that they
because
died like so young.
and Our Lady told them, "You're going to be in heaven with me real soon, but Sister Lucia, you have, well, she wasn't a sister at the time.
Right.
You have to stay on Earth for a while longer." And I remember
Yeah.
being like, "Oh, I am so jealous of Francisco and Jacinta because
What a raw deal.
I know, and like looking back on that, like, oh, there's a lot to unpack there. I was like 8 years old and like being
Yeah.
jealous of other kids dying.
Yeah.
Like, what the heck?
And like some of it persists, like in terms of, so like we were very heavy for a time. And again, I don't know, I just remember like a certain time period,
Right.
very heavy about like the end of the world, like it's coming, prepare yourselves, there's going to be all these like riots in the street, and like we're going to be killed, like all of this, like, you know, because there's very much a rhetoric of like we're the only real Catholics in the world, so like you have to be careful because, you know, they're going to come for us first, like when it's the end, right? And just like that, like traumatized me, like that constant like end of the world talk, to the point that like I now run like a non-denominational women's Bible study. And when me and the other two leaders were like discussing what study we were going to do next, someone like suggested one that like touched on like kind of like revelation stuff, and I was like, nope, can't do it, not going to lead it, I'll
Don't
leave.
blame you.
And the other two ladies were like, are you okay? Like, what's wrong? I'm like, nope, can't do it. Can't do end of the world stuff. You know, it's very much like a real trauma, like in terms of that.
Did you have like a lot of like the weird like Catholic mysticism interspersed with your end of the world stuff? Because we definitely did. Like
Yeah.
Our Lady of La Salette, would
I
like
saw your video on that. Yeah.
okay, awesome, yeah. And we had one priest who was like really into the end time stuff. And he kind of had like his own theories, and it was all like a mix of of all the different Catholic mystics with stuff from Revelation. But for us, like the popular strain of everything was, well, there has to be 1,000 years of peace before the Antichrist comes, and we definitely haven't even started the 1,000 years of peace. So
Woo!
yeah. So the whole thing, like we loved to like think about the end of the world, but we didn't think that it was coming soon. What about you
Oh, like
guys?
we were like it was imminent. Like it was
Interesting.
coming, like prepare yourself, like this is definitely like happening very soon. Yeah. And
Interesting.
and I think wrapped up in that is the whole idea of like being the only real Catholics left in the world, like, you know,
Oh, the end
it's
has got to be soon. I mean, how much
we're
worse can it
coming.
get?
It's we're the remnant, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, there was definitely a lot of that. And you know, I have been watching your videos on like different things, and you know, it did make me think of like how much certain things were, you know, like the scapular, like the rosary, like different aspects were taken out of like being a personal devotion, and more like if you don't do this, you know, bad things are going to happen to you.
Yeah, yeah. Personal devotions turned into mandatory like requirements
Yeah.
in my community.
Yeah. Even after leaving, like I like I had, you know, Catholic friends, very good Novus Ordo people, because we were involved in a homeschool group for a long time. And they'd be like, oh, you know, let's maybe moms get together and like do the rosary together. And I'd be like, mm-mm, can't do it. Because for me, that was like a punishment, you know, like get on your knees. We're going to say the rosary. It like very much has a punishment mindset. And that's, yeah,
Me
it's
too.
weaponized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um I so do you ever listen to Pints with Aquinas?
Yeah.
Okay. I couldn't even tell you what episode it was. It was maybe 2, 3, 4 months ago, something like that. Matt Fradd had a guest on, and they were talking about the rosary. And Matt Fradd said something like, "Yeah, we don't say the rosary every day, and when we do say it, my son will say to me like, Dad, like I want to draw during the rosary." So Matt Fradd said like, "So yeah, I give him like pictures of like the Blessed Virgin Mary for him to like color while we say the rosary, and isn't that beautiful?" And I just went, "Oh my gosh, like This is nothing like we got yelled at for not enunciating our words enough.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
if we were saying like Hail Mary full of grace the Lord is with thee, we would enunciate Hail Mary full of grace you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
and also we would say the rosary as part of school too. So and
Yeah.
we had a specific order that we had to go in. So if you weren't paying attention, like there would be like a gap where like you're supposed to say the next Hail Mary and you didn't say it. So then like if you didn't say it within like, you know, one Mississippi, the teacher would be like, Kevin. And you're like, oh my gosh, okay, Hail Mary full of grace. It was very much so like a punishment it was something that we had to do. And so just the idea of like letting your kids associate the rosary with something positive to me was like mind blowing. I thought that was crazy.
When I first came out of the SSPV, my husband had bought a car that gave us a year subscription to Sirius XM, right? And so randomly, I'm like, they have a Catholic channel. Wonder what this is, and turned it on and like started hearing like new evangelization type of stuff, like Father Dave Dwyer and Busted Halo and Jennifer Fulwiler and like stuff like that, like mainstream Catholic stuff, and being like really having my hair blown back by that of like, oh, these people are like not legalistic, and they're just like, hey, you know, here's what we're doing. Like, what do you need prayer for? Like, casual, not casual Catholics, because they clearly took their faith very seriously, but like that whole idea of like, how can we be kind? How can we welcome people in? How can we, you know, reach people and walk with them where they're at and all of that stuff? It was like, it seems so normal. Like, if I said that to like a regular Catholic person, they'd be like, yeah, duh, right? Like, isn't that what we're supposed to do? But it was like a revelation to me, like an absolute revelation. Wait, we want people to come in, not like kicking them out.
I know. Um, it was like a real crazy moment for me when I kind of made the switch from like all non-trad Catholics are, you know, maybe they're not heretics, but they're the closest thing to being a heretic without literally being a heretic, to like, wait a minute, no, some of these are actually like really good, decent human beings who are devout and frankly rather orthodox in their Catholicism. And their Catholicism is not this evil, awful modernist invention that I was told that it was. That was a
Yeah.
crazy moment for me.
You know, I was watching, or I was listening to like hours of these interviews with like that were on that restoration, real restoration or whatever, with these priests who had left and were talking about the controversies and stuff. And I'm like listening at my job, you know, whatever. And I realized at a certain point, so these are still like extremely trad people. Like some of them are SSPX, some of them have started their own thing. So like, so, but in no means am I saying that the people who left are like very different from the SSPV people. But they're talking about all this stuff that happened, and they're quoting this canon law, and they're like 1297 in the old code states blah 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 and this and that, and you know. And at a certain point, I got to like the end of like 6 hours of listening to this, and I'm like, they never used a biblical passage. 6 hours of them talking about like Augustine says this, and it's, you know, canon number blah 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 and this in here, and I'm like, no one ever was like, hey, Jesus said blah blah blah. I was like, what?
I know my Bible so much better now than I ever did as a trad.
Oh yeah, 100%. 100%. Like I said, I teach like Bible study like to a group of women, and you know, I feel very qualified to do so. So it's sort of funny now that, you know, that's my background, but yet I didn't learn a lot of those things there. Now, can I quote the Baltimore Catechism backwards and forwards? Yes, I can.
Who made you?
God made me.
Uh, what? It's the next question. Why did God make you? And it's
God
to.
created
Yeah.
God created me to know him, love him, and serve him in this world and be with him together forever and ever.
Yes.
So my son, my oldest, he was the oldest. So my kids, when we left, he was like 12, and my daughters were 6 and 3 when we left. So my son was kind of the only one that went through communion and that whole process there. And so he never went to the school, but he went to Sunday catechism class, right? And had to like memorize the whole thing. And he told me that he was at his job and someone said something about an angel. Now, this is when he's like 21 years old. And he recited the angel question. He's like, Mom, it was past the point of immediate recall. He's like, I hadn't
Whoa,
thought about that
wow.
since I was 8 years old. He's like, and I said it out loud. He's like, and everyone looked at me like, what? What? um,
Wow.
yeah, it stays with, I could probably recite the whole thing, honestly. Like,
I wonder if it would come back to me, but like I think I showed off literally the extent of my Baltimore catechism knowledge with those. It's just the first two questions. Like,
well, I think part of it is because I went to the school for so long, because that was every year you were
yeah.
performing the Baltimore Catechism essentially,
Yeah,
like at some
performing it.
point.
Yeah.
So,
I don't
yeah.
know about you. We had to memorize it and then we had to like stand up and recite it. Like,
Yeah. So we actually, our religion final many years was writing out the responses. And so
jeez.
so it counted as our handwriting final and our religion
Oh my
final.
gosh. Because there's nothing more important in religion than just memorizing the Baltimore catechism.
Yeah. I mean, I was never really taught to understand it, I don't
That's
think.
not necessary.
No, you just
Just,
have to know
that's
it. You
right.
just know. And then
Jeez.
later on, I think in like 11th grade, we had like an apologetics book that was like a little bit more in depth of explaining like why of things. But again, like really no Bible in any meaningful way. And like the Latin Mass has way fewer readings throughout the year than a Novus Ordo Mass.
Yep.
Like, I mean, shockingly few. You can go, like you said, to Mass 6 days a week and hear the same readings every time if it's like a whole week of Virgin Martyrs or something. It's like
Right.
the same the
Yep.
same readings. Whereas, I think I remember having situations of like sitting in the Novus Ordo church and being like, where is that in the Bible? I never heard that reading, that gospel passage, that, and being like, wow, I think there's a lot more to this maybe that I should look into.
I'm not gonna lie. So I'm in the Bible pretty like a lot kind of now. Um every now and then there's still a verse and I'm like, I swear to God, I've never heard this verse before. Like I'm talking about the New Testament. I'm talking about like a line from like Romans or something. I'll be like, this is in Romans? Like what? Like it still happens.
I mean, come on. All St. Paul ever said was we need to hold fast to the tradition. That's all he
Well,
ever said.
don't forget that he also said that line from Timothy about women being subject to their husbands,
Right, right.
and that they can't teach. Those are the only important things that Paul ever
So
said.
that women be subject to your husband's thing
Right.
was
Don't
the
keep reading. Don't keep reading about the part
no.
about husbands being subject to their wives. Just stop there.
Yes.
Um,
The priest used that as a reading at my wedding.
yeah. Wait.
Again, yeah.
Why would he pick a reading for a wedding from First Timothy when there's the option to do the classic readings, what from Romans, or it's like love is patient, love is kind, and all that?
So
Like
actually, we never read it as love. I grew up learning that was charity.
interesting.
Yeah, charity is faithful, charity is kind. And like I first heard it like having to go to a mass for someone's wedding, like a Novus Ordo mass, and I was like, psh, get these people love. That's not what St. Paul was saying. Love.
Do you know the word in Greek? Because now I'm interested. Is it agape? Is that the Greek
No,
word?
it's Chaire. It's Kyra.
And is
Or
that the
however you
same
pronounce
word
it.
that is used for charity, like in other parts of the New Testament?
Yeah, it's more like favor.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna have to like look into that like a little bit more. So, but do you think is charity? Do you think that charity is actually the better translation
No,
of?
no,
No. Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Okay. That's interesting
But
though.
no, but I mean, I think it goes back to like you can't have, too much love, right? Like love is a dangerous thing.
Yeah. Um, Also, were you guys Douay Reams only? In
Yes.
term, yeah, we were Douay Reams only for our Bible, which like I don't
Yeah.
understand the like why the Douay Reams? What's so important? Like what was so special about the Douay Reams?
I don't know. I have to say now for like personal study, I use the New Revised Standard. What a
It's
great translation.
I
Like,
agree.
yeah. I mean, I know there's a lot of translations out there, but that's my personal go-to is the NRSV. It's really good.
I don't understand the King James or the Douay Reams like fascination, because
Right.
words change their meaning, and so like
Right.
it's just less clear, and like I don't understand the benefit of reading it in any language other than the language that is the most familiar to me, and the original language, which for the entire New
Yeah.
Testament is Greek. Like
Yeah, no, I
why should
agree.
I read an inferior English translation? you know, you know what I mean? Like I could
I
just
mean,
Google it in Greek. You
come on,
know?
Kevin. Why aren't we all reading the Message Bible?
Wait, what was the Message Bible?
Oh, oh, okay. So this is definitely not a Catholic thing. That there's a Bible translation out there. It's called The Message, and it like literally reads like Zane Grey like wrote a western about the Bible. Like that's what it is. It's like super translated, like New Living Translation type of thing. But it is like
Wow.
it's interesting.
Is it like a is it like super translated, but it's actually kind of accurate to the source material? It's just
Oh, it's
like
definitely not.
okay,
Accurate
okay,
to the
never
source
mind then.
material. No, no. It's like if you wanted to read like the New Testament as a west as like a spaghetti western, like that's what it
I'm
sounds
not.
like to
That's kind
me.
of cool.
um, yeah. So I don't know. Like I had some other things on my list, like in terms of refusal of communion and the ways kind of they get around doing that and things like that. But one thing I just wanted to touch on, especially as we're talking about sort of charity, love, that kind of thing, is like I really do think there's a lack of it. Not again in the people in the pews. That's a completely different story. But like in a lot of ways that are important. So my when my brother passed away. He was killed in a drunk, killed by a drunk driver about 10 years ago. And my mom made the decision, even though he had been away from St. Pius V for a very long time, me and my sister no longer attended. She was like, I want the funeral and everything to be through them. And my sister and I were like, I don't know really if he would have wanted that, but he was active duty Navy at the time that he passed away. So you can imagine that like the church is just packed with like Navy people in dress uniform, huge military funeral. Like it was crazy. And the priest who had known Patrick since he was very little got up and preached this like scathing sermon basically about like he's been away from the sacraments, but like we're doing this mass because we still have hope for his soul. And like
Oh,
it was
jeez.
awful. And like we got up and people were like horrified. I remember the getting up and turning around and just seeing the faces behind me of people who had no clue what this church was and being like, what just happened? Like this is wild. And the juxtaposition of everyone who wasn't in that, in the SSPV kind of saying, um, that was bonkers and really weird and like probably the weirdest eulogy we've ever heard in our lives. Because they said nothing personal about my brother. Again, had known him since he was a little kid, taught him to altar serve the whole bit, and like didn't have anything personal to say, just like, you know, kind of sucks he's dead, hope he's not burning in the fires of hell type of sermon. And then the SSPV people who turned around and was like, wasn't Father charitable in his comments? And so I think there's just like a real divide, right? You know, between what should, it's irony, right? What the difference between what should be and what actually is. If you have a so-called Catholic church where you're trying to do work in bringing people in, you lack a lot of the things that are necessary for that. You're lacking charity, you're lacking empathy, you're lacking inclusivity, things like that. But yet you're saying you're the only Catholics in the world. Well, secrecy doesn't help your cause, right? Like you want to be more open, not less open. So, and that's my biggest, I think, issue with it. Like the lack of just basic kindness in a lot of ways. And then the lack of transparency. You know, I think I didn't understand when I was in it that that's not how most groups work, most religious organizations, be it the regular Catholic Church, be it your average Baptist church, Presbyterian, whatever. Like that level of secrecy isn't normal. And when I was listening to kind of all these interviews and things, that was said over and over again by the priests who left of like, you're either in or you're out. And if you're out, you don't know anything. And if you're in, you know what the leader wants you to know. And that's kind of that's a high control group, right? Like so that level of secrecy is just if anyone takes anything watching this takes anything away from it, just the knowledge of like what you're experiencing isn't normal. Because that was the shock for me leaving. Like again, opening that bulletin and being like, "Oh, it's the financials for the church." Like, what? And they're a 501c whatever organization, right? So they're a nonprofit. Their financials are supposed to be public, and they're not. Like, I'm supposed to be able to write a letter if I want to and get their financial statements in the mail. Could I? I don't know. So,
Interesting.
yeah. So that's sort of like, you know, if anyone listening to this takes anything else away, I just want you to know like if you're in it and you're confused or you're leaving or you're taking a break and you're watching this, you pull this up at any point, like that level of secrecy and that level of control is not what church is supposed to be about. It's not normal what you're experiencing. Ask some questions, do some digging, and look for the answers. They're out there.
I think that's a beautiful way to end the show. Megan, your story is a very important one to share because there's not there's not a whole lot of people who've been through what you've been through. And as far as I know, this is the first time that this has been put on YouTube. So I have to imagine that the next time that somebody goes on YouTube and tries to look up leaving the SSPV or something like that, this is going to come up. And I think that this is, for the first time, right? Somebody who wants to hear from the other side is actually going to be able to hear something. And pat ourselves on the back. I think that's really important, right? I think it's so important that people are able to hear this. And so I just wanted to thank you for doing so on my platform. I'm honored that you were able to.
I'm really happy that, that we made this work. And, like I said, I don't have sour grapes with anybody. I have no animosity. There's nothing left. Like, it's fine. You live your life, I'll live my life. It's all good. Like, I'm not cranky at anybody. I'm not here to like sow division or, create problems or anything like that. I want to be the resource that I wish I had had.
I love that. Megan, thanks again for coming on. I think that you've already said it perfectly. Was there any final note that you wanted to end on? Is there a best way if somebody wanted to get in contact with you? Can I refer them to the comment section down below? And
absolutely.
Leave a comment. I'm gonna monitor the comments.
Sounds great.
If I find something that I want to send to you, I'll screenshot it and send it over to you in case you want to respond.
Please do.
Perfect. Okay. Megan, thanks again. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And until next time.